esta nueva sesión del seminario permanente Espacio, Cultura y Turismo que organizamos en conjunto el Instituto de Geografía y la Escuela Nacional de Ciencias de la Tierra. Es un gusto el día de hoy recibir a la doctora Rita Baleiro, quien nos va a presentar la conferencia sobre turismo literario, que es un tema pues relativamente nuevo y que en el caso mexicano pues también es algo que se ha trabajado mucho. Antes de ceder la palabra a mi colega, la doctora Driselda Sánchez, quien es coordinadora también de este seminario, quiero hacer un breve repaso de los objetivos y la intención de este seminario que inició en 2022 y que bueno, hemos estado coordinando con Driselda desde entonces, y la intención es justamente tener un espacio donde se discutan estos temas desde diferentes enfoques, desde diferentes áreas. Entonces hemos tenido participantes de las áreas de geografía, de turismo, de sociología, incluso de antropología o de historia. Nos interesa mucho también en este seminario la perspectiva de las mujeres, aunque no es exclusivamente para mujeres, pero es una perspectiva que nos ha interesado mucho. Y bueno, la mayoría de las participantes han sido mujeres, lo cual pues nos permite también tener un grupo que concentra estas discusiones, a partir del cual se han creado también nuevas redes. Se han presentado nuevos temas a los estudiantes y el público en general interesado en estos temas. Entonces, bueno, para no quitar más tiempo también a la conferencia, pues nuevamente reitero mis agradecimientos a la doctora Rita, quien se conecta desde Portugal y pues ha hecho un espacio en su agenda en estos días, además que son tan complicados para poder estar aquí con nosotros. Y bueno, estamos seguras que será una conferencia, una charla muy interesante y de la que aprenderemos mucho. Entonces, pues muchas gracias, que disfruten esta plática y adelante también con la presentación. Driselda, por favor.
Gracias. Bueno, el día de hoy, como mencionaba Ilia, nos acompaña Rita Baleiro. Ella es profesora coordinadora de la Escuela de Gestión, Hospitalidad y Turismo en la Universidad de Algarve. Ella enseña idiomas para propósitos específicos, por ejemplo, inglés para el turismo, inglés para la industria hospitalaria, inglés para negocios y portugués para la cultura también. Ella tiene un doctorado en estudios de literatura y una maestría en cultura norteamericana de la Facultad de Ciencias Sociales y Humanidades de la Universidad Nova de Lisboa. Ella ha coeditado 2 libros, Turismo, Gestión y Hospitalidad. Ella es coeditora en el Journal de Turismo, Gestión y Hospitalidad desde 2007 y en 2023 se ha unido al Journal de Turismo y Cambios Culturales como parte del comité editorial. Sus áreas de investigación son el turismo literario y las intersecciones entre la literatura y el turismo, así como la escritura académica. Es miembro del comité científico de CITUR, el Centro para la Investigación del Turismo, Desarrollo e Innovación, también del Centro de Literatura de Investigación.
Houve algum problema técnico?
Sí,
Sim,
bueno.
mas não faz mal. Eu posso terminar a apresentação simpática que a Driselda estava a fazer. Em 2023 publiquei um livro sobre turismo literário e turismo cinematográfico e em 2024 um livro sobre pesquisa de turismo literário em conjunto com uma colega da Eslovénia, um colega italiano e um colega do Reino Unido. Portanto, tenho publicado nesta área há mais ou menos 10 anos. E vou então, Ilia, posso começar, certo?
Por favor, muito obrigada.
Obrigada. Então, I'm going to talk in English. First and foremost, I want to thank Driselda, Aguirre, Ilia, Alvarado, Sizzo for the invitation. It's really a pleasure to be here today with you. This is the title of my presentation, From Pages to Places, Researching Literary Tourism. So, just a short introduction about the place where I come from so that you all have an idea. I'm a professor, coordinating professor at the University of the Algarve. Algarve is in the south of Portugal in a town called Faro. We have 9,000 students, 3 campi, and we have 8 schools. And like Driselda was saying, I'm a lecturer at the Management, Hospitality and Tourism School. So Being in a tourism school and having studied literature and languages for so many years, I decided to combine these two areas, and hence literary tourism. This is the structure of my presentation. I will start by debating how come these two areas can intersect. Then I will focus on the definition of literary tourism, what type of research is possible, and then, if I have time, which I hope I will, I'm going to focus on two research projects that I have conducted. First, how to analyze the tourist experience at the literary place, and the other one about the experience and motivation of literary tourists. And I will conclude with some final remarks. So, tourism and literature studies are carried out in the scope of social sciences and refer to an inter- and multidisciplinary field of research, tourism and literature. Also, as a sort of a motto to start, I bring you 3 sentences by Michel Onfray, a French philosopher who wrote about the theory. He wrote a book entitled Théorie du voyage. And he says, the desire to travel is fueled by literary ghosts. A mere line, even by an average author, sparks more desire for the described place than photographs or even films, videos, or reports. Between us and the world, we prioritize words. And he says all these beautiful sentences that connect literature and tourism in a book published in 2007 and page 26. So the concepts, what bridges tourism and literature? The concepts of representation, place, and space. The representations of space in literature, the places associated with the writer's lives, and the physical space implied in the traveling act, because tourism refers to displacements in space. Tourism provides the theme for fictional literary works, as, for example, Flights by the Nobel Prize winner in literature, the Polish writer Olga Tokarczuk, and also non-fictional literary works, as it happens in The Journey to Portugal by José Saramago, a Portuguese author, also a Nobel Prize winner in literature. Reading a literary text can give meaning to a place and creating a new perception of that place, a new layer of meaning to a site. On the other hand, visiting the place described or represented in a text has the potential to add extra layers of meaning to the literary text. So there's an intersection between text and space that may change the perception and the understanding of each other. I bring you a case so it makes it easier to understand what I'm talking about. This is the palace and convent of Mafra in Portugal. It's close to Lisbon. It's UNESCO World Heritage Monument since 2019. And this palace and convent was built under the reign of King John V of Portugal. He promised to build this palace if he and the Queen had a child, which eventually happened, and when their daughter was born. The king wanted to build a symbol of his power, and he wanted to surpass the greatness and the beauty of St. Peter's Basilica in the Vatican. So he wanted something magnificent. Construction started in 1717 and concluded in 1755. So it was a very short period for such a huge endeavor. So it happens that most Portuguese children, when we are in school, we go on field trips to this historical monument, and it's also a tourist attraction. And children go there when they are in school, and they go with the school, the teachers and the other colleagues, especially if you live in nearby, which was my case. So when I was around 12, I went there with my school. And I was impressed by its architecture, dimension, richness, And I imagined the king and the queen walking in the long corridors of the palace, the staff moving around, bringing things. And I imagined the food being prepared in the kitchens. And I was amazed by how small the king's and the queen's beds were. Then it happened that a wonderful, wonderful book was written in 1982 by José Saramago, the Portuguese Nobel Prize winner in literature. And he wrote this book, and the plot of the book is about the construction of this palace convent. It's about the king's eccentricity, the poverty of the people, the sacrifice of the people who built the palace. It's about the priest, Father Bartolomeu, who dreamed about flying machines. And it's also about a love story between Balthazar and Blimunda. Balthazar and Blimunda is the title of the English translation of the book. It is indeed a magical book that blends history, fiction, facts, fantasy. I read the book, and later on, I visited the palace again. My perception of what I saw was now totally steered by José Saramago's book. And I could only see the sacrifice of the people who built it. I saw Balthazar and Blimunda's love story, and I saw the flying machine. The king and the queen were totally in the background for me. For me, these monuments had become a literary place because I had attached a literary meaning to these sites. Just a note on this book. This book is so marvelous, and it was so important for so many people that when Saramago died in 2010, his wife placed a copy of this book in his coffin after a suggestion from the most important Portuguese philosopher, Eduardo Lourenço. So I highly recommend reading it. So this semiotic process of resignifying places into literary places can either be individual, like it happened to me when I read the book and I visited the palace. I have knowledge of the text and I attribute a different meaning to what I'm seeing. Or it can happen collectively when the tourist and the cultural industry produces and signals these places to the visitors, like it happens in literary parks, literary museums, book villages, or towns. Because the meaning of places is not a fixed entity, if we identify literary references associated with a place, we can promote the creation of a literary place, which in other words can also be a literary tourism destination. So a literary place is like a segment of space with literary meaning. It's the number one unit of literary tourism. It's after the identification of literary places that I can create routes and tours, for instance. Roland Barthes says that the literary text has several entrances. The same goes for reading and interpreting space. So I bring you another example. As you can see in the image, it says Café Restaurante Martinho da Arcada. This is a cafe restaurant in Lisbon. So it's a commercial space. Any tourist visiting Lisbon walks by and sees a restaurant. But if that tourist is knowledgeable about literature, or if the tourist industry has signaled this cafe as a reference as having references in literature, this place also becomes a literary place if we consider that Fernando Pessoa, who was a very, very notable poet in Portugal, used to be a customer here, and he wrote some of his texts in this cafe. So the signifier is the same. It's still a cafe, but the signified is not. The meaning I attribute is not. I bring you another example, this time in France, the Castle of If. The Castle of If is a heritage site with historical value, but it can also be a literary place if interpreted considering the novel The Count of Monte Cristo by Dumas. The main character, Edmond Dante, was imprisoned here. Again, the signifier is the same, but the signifier is not. This can happen to places, but it can also happen, we can also see countries as literary tourism destinations. We have United Kingdom, for instance, has designs for tourism purposes, a literary map where you have the country and all the writers, the places where they lived, the places they wrote about. And there's also the example of Spain. They also have a literary map. These can be tools used for promotion of the country. And they may target people interested in literature, but also people that are just curious about that. So what is this literary tourism? What are we talking about? Literary tourism is a form of literary heritage-based tourism that refers to touring, to traveling places that have a literary meaning. Like I said before, they are called literary places. This significance results from the spatial representation in literary texts, but it can also result from the writer's biographical information. Like I gave you the example of Fernando Pessoa that used to go to that cafe. So literary significance can also come from the biography of the author, not just the text. Or it can also be created by the tourist and culture industry that produces places where literature is celebrated, as in literary museums or literary festivals. Literary tourism has started to be a topic in research currently, but it's not a new phenomenon. In the 18th century, the topographical accuracy of some texts had the ability to open up the novel to the physical world and spark the desire to visit these places firsthand. Nicola Watson, she's one of the main researchers in literary tourism, recalls that as early as 1764, a traveler, James Boswell, most likely one of the first literary tourists, walked in the footsteps, which is the same thing as saying walked and visited the literary places of the character Julie from Jean-Jacques Rousseau's epistolary novel, Julie ou la Nouvelle Héloïse. This novel was probably the biggest bestseller of the century and made Rousseau the first celebrity author after Petrarch in the 16th century. So literary places are unique because they refer to a single text, to a single author. For this reason, they can be very attractive to visitors and an extremely useful resource for the tourism and cultural industry. After the process of identifying or producing literary places, literary tourism products can be created. And I bring you this image. I know the quality of the image is not the best, but it's from a paper I published together with a colleague in 2020, last year. And there are three types of products: those associated with the author biography, associated with authors in general and literary art, and associated with the narrative, with the plots. So the first, associated with the author's biography, visits to writers' home museums, for instance. Visits to places where writers went, wrote, got inspired to write. Visits to authors' graves, for instance. Then we have those products associated with literature and authors, participation in literary tours. Visitors can have a tour of Lisbon just following on the footsteps of Fernando Pessoa or Saramago. Visits to literary parks, visits to stays in literary hotels, and then associated with the plot of the books or of the literary works. We can visit the places or landscapes depicted in the text, and we can organize and offer tours to places or landscapes associated with the characters of those texts. Now, the third part of my presentation, which is literary tourism research. Let me just have a sip of water, please. So, over the last 20 years, like I said, literary tourism research has significantly expanded. These are just a few examples of people that have been researching. Arcos Pomarola, a Spanish colleague from the University of Barcelona, has studied literary tourism lately. Samet Cevic also. Jasna Toplar-Potocznik. Myself, Giovanni Capecchi, who is the head of a research group about literary tourism in Italy, and Charles Mansfield in the UK. However, not so long ago, the research and practice of literary tourism was a palpable embarrassment among scholars, making them thoroughly uneasy, like Nicola Watson reminds us. Even though these feelings often coexisted with an undisclosed wish to go on literary pilgrimages, literary tours, and literary readings in situ. This attitude of some reservation towards literary tourism research very likely resulted from the predominant influence of structuralism, which advocated that there is nothing outside the texts. Language and texts are understood as self-enclosed systems in which the critical connections are those between the text signifiers and not those between words and the exterior objects or elements they represent. However, the extrinsic context of literary work and the notion of the text without limits started to be addressed as well. Reader response criticism and the transactional theory of meaning formation, Louise Rosenblatt, Wolfgang Iser, are some of the authors, advocated that only the reader's active interaction determines the realization of the text. This same principle seems to consciously or unconsciously motivate visitors to go on literary touring, so they fill in the gaps of the literary text after the intersection between the projections of what they read and the elements they see in the space. This view, transferred to tourism and literature studies via the geographical, the humanist approaches to tourism, and the spatial turn and the geographical turn in tourism, highlights that the experience of the place aids in the understanding of the literary texts or authors. So this perception started to motivate the appearance of literary cartography, the mapping of literary elements in space. This can be used to produce tourism experiences and helped visitors understand the text and its spatial representations better. Just like a literary text is not a collection of printed marks on the page, but rather the result of an active process lived through the relationship between a reader and the text. In other words, the literary text results of this subjective construction of the reader with the words. So, literary cartography, or the construction of literary maps, does not refer to a collection of printed files, but it is the result of an interpretation of a narrative that is created about a space. So we can ask ourselves, how are literary references transferred to the physical geography? Well, this happens because literary texts can act as files of representation, whose elements, symbols, images, can be drawn into the physical space and steer visitors' gaze, leading them to attribute new meanings to what they are seeing. The places depicted in literary texts may be mapped and dragged to the geographical space. There have been, however, different views on dragging the literary representation of space beyond the pages of the book. Two such different visions are those of Virginia Woolf and James Joyce, two modernists. So, on the one hand, Virginia Woolf states that a writer's country is a territory within his own brain, and we run the risk of disappointment if we try to turn such ghost cities into tangible brick and mortar. To insist that the writer's city has any counterpart in the cities of the earth is to rob it of half its charm. On the other hand, James Joyce said, and he said this to his friends, that if Dublin were to disappear, his book, Ulysses, would illustrate it so perfectly that Dublin could be rebuilt. And now I'm quoting, I want to give a picture of Dublin so complete that if one day the city suddenly disappears or disappeared from the earth, it could be reconstructed from my book. Woolf understands space in literature as a construction of the imagination. Joyce views the literary representation of space as the tangible physicalness of what is outside the text. The reference of the text are external to the text. Therefore, ultimately, Dublin could be reconstructed from the text. Well, fictional or non-fictional literary texts are always subjective representations of the physical world, but that doesn't stop them from creating, building bridges to the real world, whatever real means, but to the physical world. The places of fiction identified by literary cartography can be mapped, like we said, because, like the geographer Talley Jr. tells us, to tell a story is to draw a map, and drawing a map is always synonymous with telling a story. Okay, so this view bridges literature, geography, cartography, and tourism. The inscription of literary texts in space, either it's through implicit or explicit representations of places, favors the manifestation of the literary text as a map. Even though a map enunciates our idea of the world, it is not its reality, because it is a subjective selection that does not have the pulp of the literary text. Mapping literary fiction places can be extraordinarily useful for visitors. It provides special references to guide and steer their gaze, and for the tourism industry, as it allows the creation of literary places, literary tourism products, and ultimately literary tourism destinations. I'm moving on to the fourth part of my presentation, which is how to analyze the tourist experience at the literary tourism attraction. So the attraction I selected were the literary museums in Portugal. Literary museums refer to one genre of museums in the constellation of museums that document, celebrate literature and writers. They house collections of books, manuscripts, tools of the literary writing trade or craft, photographs, videos, personal effects, period objects, or replicas of those objects. Sometimes these museums also house research centers, libraries, and exhibitions, either permanent or non-permanent. So the challenges I faced was an absence of an inventory of the Portuguese literary museums. And another challenge I had was how to reach the visitors of the museums. I did not have the time or the money to go to all these museums, especially because many of them are in the north of Portugal and I am in the south. So how could I reach the visitors of the museums? So I assume that the tourist experience continues post-visits. And I also, and following Alexander and colleagues, I also took the assumption that the interpretation of visitors' reviews may contribute valuable information to understanding visitors' experience. So what to do after? So I started with an inventory of Portuguese literary museums, and I'm going to focus on the methodology to do this. So I analyzed the Visit Portugal website. I read academic works on the topic. I researched on Google. I emailed to the National Board for Cultural Heritage, and I made phone calls to regional tourist office. And I came to a total of 31 literary museums in Portugal. Then I had to identify the museums that had reviews on TripAdvisor. Out of the 31, only 12 were on TripAdvisor. So I collected manually the users' comments until 2022. And most of these reviews were published between 2014 and 2019. Step number 3, to analyze the data. So I used NVivo for content analysis. It's a qualitative data analysis software, and it identifies high-frequency themes and sub-themes in data sets. So I codified the reviews, and I identified the high-frequency coding references. After, I had to eliminate the errors in the coding process and confirm the identification of those high-frequency coding references. Then I had 2 colleagues validating the coding process. So it's validation by a third party. And what were the results? So I had 458 reviews, 1,052 coded references, and I had 7 high-frequency themes and 23 sub-themes deriving from those high-frequency themes. The first high-frequency theme was the visit experience, and the sub-themes were learning about the author, life, the author's life, work, historical context. So these are the sub-themes of the high-frequency theme visits. Disappointment, feeling close to the author, authenticity, emotion, return to the past, tranquility, magic, surprise, imagination, experiencing the place that inspired the author, experiencing the place where the book was set, enjoyment. So I bring you the sub-themes for the most, for the highest high-frequency theme. The other 6 were museum organization, practical advice, so the tips that the reviewers on TripAdvisor offer to other visitors, but also offer the management team of the museum to improve the visit, the collection, and this refers to the personal objects on display, the non-permanent exhibitions or the permanent exhibitions. The author, what visitors said about the author or authors celebrated in the museum. The experience of place, the building, and also the surrounding areas, and the attitude resulting from the experience. And this refers to, I want to learn more about the author. Some reviewers said, I want to read his books, her books. So the main conclusions of the study were that definitely literary museums can collapse time and space, and they are the tangible link between the world of the living and the world of the dead. The museum experience is an opportunity to travel back in time. And what visitors said was that they learned about the authors, their historical time, and their work. Some visitors even stated that they felt the presence of the author, okay? Not literally, obviously, but through the objects, and mostly when the museum is housed in a former home of the author. The experience of the visit often generated a wish to learn more about the author or authors. The personal objects are fundamental to conveying authenticity. And another conclusion that I took from this research was that the guides at the museum are key to create, very important, to create a positive experience. Before I move on to another research that I did about literary tourism, I want to say that still about these museums, most are, in Portugal at least, there are 31 literary museums, but only 4 are about women writers. So I don't understand why this happens, because there are magnificent women writers, female writers in Portugal with an amazing work. So I hope this changes in the future. I'm now moving on to almost the last part of my presentation, which is and I'm going to present the results of another research I conducted, colleagues and I conducted about the experience and motivation of literary tourists. So our aim was to contribute empirical data on literary tourists, namely their experience and motivation to go on literary touring. So we decided to conduct a survey. Our specific objectives were to identify practices for organizing and preparing literary tourism visits, and to find out what the most visited literary places were. We also wanted to identify the motivations to go on literary touring, and we wanted to identify the most surprising aspects of the visits. But we had a challenge, or a couple of them. We were not interested in analyzing the experience of just one literary place. Sorry. If we wanted that, we could just go to a writer's house or writer's home museum and interview the visitors. We wanted to access tourists that had visited several and different types of places. So the main challenge was to find literary tourists with diverse experiences. So we could apply the questionnaire to them. And the questionnaire was obviously designed after the literature review. So another challenge was to analyze the literary visitor's experience, as experience is a very broad concept. So we had a couple of assumptions regarding experience. Due to the complexity of these concepts as an individual's psychological process, the analysis of the experience focused on its constituent elements, such as motivation and the meanings the visitors attribute to literary tourism visits after interacting with the place. So, like I said, we did not wish to analyze the experience of just one literary place. Therefore, we decided to find a database of literary tourists and inquire them about their previous visits. To do that, like I said, we had a questionnaire designed after the literature review, and we had 420 participants in a literary festival in Brazil. And we inquired them, but not about the festival, not about the literary festival. We inquired them about their previous experiences of literary tourism, because we assumed that they were people with an interest in literature. When did we do this? Well, the questionnaire survey was applied 1 week after the festival. Sorry, I forgot the date. It was 2022. The sample. In the end, we had 79 respondents that were those who had literary experiences prior to the festival, because we did not wish to inquire about the festival. We used SPSS. So what's the demographic profile? Well, gender. Most literary tourists were female. 47 is the average age of the female respondents, and 42 is the average age of the male respondents. So we are not talking about young people, okay? We are talking early middle-age visitors. Education, a large majority holds a university degree, and they are in the upper middle class. And this classification was based on their annual income, which was one of the questions we included in the survey. These demographic results have confirmed previous studies on literary tourism, studies by Busby and Chetliff, Ingram and al, MacLeod and al. What about travel preparation and traveling companions? Well, time invested in the preparation. 37.2, which is the highest percentage, prepared their literary tourism visit between 1 month and 3 months, so quite a long time. But we also have 32.6 who prepare it between a week and a month, but there is some investments. What was the preparation methods? Mostly online research for half of the respondents. But they also resort to travel agencies, but not in a large number, as you can see. Without preparation, almost 20% of the respondents did not prepare their literary travel because they were invited by a friend, a colleague. Travel companions. Well, they traveled with family and friends, but also a significant percentage traveled alone. Number of literary visits. The analysis revealed that most respondents had already visited at least 2 literary places. On average, visitors with a higher income undertook a significantly higher number of visits, which is easy to understand. What's the most popular literary place or the literary tourism products? They are the writers' home museums. They are the most popular attraction. This result is also unsurprising since this literary tourist attraction has been one of the most popular over the last 4 centuries, like Watson tells us. Regarding the motivations, the questionnaire presented 15 variables that we identified in the literature review. The results show that the most common motivation is to better understand the literary work. Motivations. These results, to better understand the text, revealed that respondents acknowledge that the experience of literary tourism contributes to adding new elements to the interpretation of the text. The role of experiencing a place in the understanding of literature has already been identified by the geographical and humanistic approaches to literary tourism that I mentioned earlier. These results also highlight the educational potential of the literary tourism experience to contribute to textual hermeneutics. The motivation to better understand the literary work, which was the main motivation. This result also evokes what Harold Hendricks called dissatisfaction with the limits of the literary work, and shows that visitors acknowledge that visiting literary places or going on literary touring has the potential to expand their literary capital via the experience of the literary place. This motivation is consistent with the fact that the writer's house is the most visited place by the respondents, because the experience of the visit to the place where the author lived and worked is often expected to act as an addendum to reading and a complement to the portrait of the authors. Now, interaction, imagination, and co-creation. The correlational analysis of the motivations and the surprising aspects of the experience reveal the link between the motivation to better understand the work and the surprising role of the imagination in the co-creation process of the place. This result shows that respondents acknowledge the role of imagination as a co-creation device in the production and consumption of these type of places. This means that when confronted with something unfamiliar, imagination is implied in an act that requires the active participation of the visitor rather than being strictly controlled by the physical context. What were the three most surprising aspects of the experience? The importance of imagination in the co-creation of the places, of the literary texts. The fact that visitors could see the places they had imagined when they were reading the texts. And the fact that visitors felt emotional during the visit to the literary place. We have published this study in this paper in 2022. And now I get to my final remarks. So, final remarks. Uniqueness, impact, and impacts. Well, literary tourism, because it draws on literary heritage, and literary heritage is unique to each territory, to each region, to each country. It highlights what is unique and it cannot be reproduced about a tourist destination. And equally unique and not replicable are the literary tourism products that can be created after these references. Impacts. On the one hand, we have valorization and preservation of the built heritage, like it happens with the former authors' houses. We have preservation of literary memory, historical memory, and also we can have an impact on less visited destinations. Because we can also always associate an author that lived there or wrote there, or an author that wrote about that place, and we can improve the attractiveness of that less visited destination. And also there could be an impact on literacy. We can contribute, literary tourism can contribute to expanding literary literacy. Before I go, I want to tell you about this project that started in 2022 or 2023. No, 2022. It's an online dictionary. It's open to everybody. It's only about literary tourism. So if you Google it, you will find it. And we are always looking for new contributions. All contributions undergo a double-blind review process. So you are all invited. And before I close, I want to leave you with a quote by Proust. And he says, had my parents allowed me, when I read the book, to pay a visit to the region it described, I should have felt that I was making an enormous advance towards the ultimate conquest of truth. And with this, I close my presentation. Thank you again for the invitation, and I'm here to answer to your questions.
Thank you so much, Rita. A really interesting topic. Here in Mexico, we have a lot of things that could be related to literary tourism, as Ilia was saying. I was thinking about another example in Cuernavaca. It's a small town nearby Mexico City, and we have a very famous novel that was placed there. It's Bajo el Volcán, Malcolm Lowry. I don't know if you have heard about it, but
No,
it's really interesting because Malcolm Lowry, the author, spent like 10 years in this place. He was a Briton, I guess, and he wrote the novel there. about the Day of the Dead and all of things.
Mhm.
But as you said, the most attractive the most touristic place is the hotel where he used to stay.
Exactly.
So
Yeah.
yeah, and even the hotel changed its name to the name of the
Of
book.
the author after the
Novel.
book.
Yeah,
Okay.
so it's really interesting, and people goes there to see the room where Malcolm Lowry in 1940 or something like that wrote the novel, and I think it's really interesting, this whole phenomenon where people just move to places to recreate maybe some fictions, maybe some realities, but it's really interesting. I don't know if you can talk us more about maybe this last part about the dictionary, how it's developed, where does the idea come from, or
Well, I studied in Universidade Nova in Lisbon, na Faculdade de Ciências Sociais e Humanas in Lisbon. And shortly after I graduated, one of my professors at that university started to create an online dictionary about literary theory. So I thought it was a very good idea because if you have a book, a dictionary, a physical dictionary, you can include new entries, new texts, but you have to have a new edition, which is quite expensive. So I thought that online, people could add and even meant in some cases contributions, and it would be a work in progress, open to everybody. So you did not have to buy the book of the dictionary. So I had that idea, and after that, I started to work with a group of researchers about literary tourism. And these researchers were in Italy, in France, in Switzerland, and they wanted to start something new and something about literary tourism, and to offer a resource that could be open for students and other researchers. So we were discussing that, and I thought, well, why not an online dictionary like the one I saw at the university where I used to study? And they liked the idea, so we started the dictionary, baby steps at the beginning. We did not have many entries in the dictionary, but we knew that we wanted to have core concepts of the area. We wanted to have the concept of literature, the concept of literary tourism for sure, the concept of literary place. And then we started to expand to examples of cases, like case studies. So we can have a dictionary text or entry about a specific village where tourism has expanded because there's an association with the author, for instance. Or we have examples of literary tours that were created in Italy. So I suggest that you visit the dictionary. It's open access. And if you are interested in submitting a proposal, you can send the proposal to me, and then we will correspond afterwards, because every text undergoes a double-blind review process. So each text is evaluated by two researchers anonymously, and then we return the comments to the author of the text, and then after all the alterations, we finally publish. And until now, we have about I think around 70 texts in the dictionary, but we hope to reach 100 soon. So
Great.
you are all invited. Yes.
Thank you. We're going to share it with all our networks and see if anyone is interested. At least me, I'm going to try to contribute in some way.
Yes, Ilia, at the beginning of today, at the beginning of the presentation today, she said that she's interested in film tourism. So there are many connections between film tourism and literary tourism. So if you want, you and Ilia can write a text about film tourism and literary tourism with some examples and how they intersect, because there are many, many examples.
Great, sure. We have a comment in social media. It's from Isaac Guzman. He says that in Morelos, the place I was talking about, Cuernavaca,
Yes.
is located in a state that's called Morelos. And he says that there are many places that have been inspired literary books. And it's a real interesting theme, the literary tourists.
Thank you. Thank you.
I have one last question. It's about this part that you have found the like a segment, a niche market, I guess so, because it's really, really specific, like their university level and 40 or more years old. Do you think that literary tourism could be for younger people, could be attractive for younger people, and how?
Yes, that's a very good question. Because all the surveys, the one that I conducted and all the previous research, they all indicated that literary tourists were older people, 50 years old or older. And this year, a student of mine, master student, she did a research about young people and literary tourism. So she conducted a survey as well, but her target was young people, and young people, according to the definition of young, is people aged between young adults are from, sorry, I can't recall now, but 18 up to 29. I think that's 18, 29 years old. And she interviewed a lot of hundreds of young people, not interviewed, sorry. She asked them to answer the questionnaire, and their answers were surprising. They are very curious about literary tourism. They want to go on literary touring, but they want to have more technology. They want the literary tourism products not to be the old house museum of the author, or the hotel where the author has stayed, but they want to see some virtual reality implemented. They want to have more technology, but they do have an interest in literary tourism. So there's a future for literary tourism, for certain, but maybe the industry has to adapt to these new people and the way they like to do things nowadays, which is much faster than our generation and much more technological than we are.
Yeah, for sure. Also, I think it could depend on the genre, right? Of if it's like romantic novel or maybe
exactly
something.
Yes, but they also like romantic novels, and they want to visit the places where the novels. I can't recall the name of the novel now, but there's a novel where the characters travel to Amsterdam.
Wow!
And in Amsterdam, they visit Anne Frank's house. So many of the young people who answered the survey, they mentioned that book. I don't recall the name now, but they mentioned that book, and they mentioned that they also want to go to Amsterdam, like the characters in the book, and visit Anne Frank's house. So, and that's a romantic novel, like a romance. And so they are interested. They are interested. Yes.
Yeah. Oh, that's really good for future generations.
And it is very good. And there's also a phenomenon on TikTok. A lot of influencers are talking about books. They do short videos about books. And the respondents of my student survey also revealed the importance and the influence of the short TikTok videos on their wish to visit to a literary tourism destination.
Wow, that's really interesting.
Yeah. It was very, very interesting to find these findings. But yeah, these results.
Well, we don't have any more questions or comments in social media, but the video will stay there. So if there's any more comments or question, I will let you know and write you via.
Thank you, Driselda. Thank you once again for the invitation.
Thank you for your time. We have learned a lot, and it was really great to see you. And
likewise.
Thank you. Y muchas gracias Rita por el apoyo en esta sesión. Muchas gracias al equipo técnico, Marina, Juan Carlos. Y con esto cerramos este ciclo de conferencias del Seminario Internacional Espacio, Cultura y Turismo. Esta fue nuestra última conferencia, cerramos con broche de oro y les esperamos el próximo año para más actividades. Gracias a todas.
Merry Christmas.
Felices fiestas a todos.
Bye.